Good evening. My name is Vanessa Corriher-Olson. I'm the Forage Extension Specialist with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension, office in Overton and East Texas. And in the time that I've been a forage specialist, I have gotten multiple questions over the years on alfalfa and growing alfalfa in Texas, and more specifically, growing alfalfa in East Texas. So prior to my joining the Overton team, our soil scientist, who is retired, Dr. Vince Habe, did some work on alfalfa, determining whether or not or how we could grow alfalfa in East Texas on our typically very sandy, acidic soils. And that's a big challenge because alfalfa, being a perennial legume, is very sensitive to soil pH. And so there has been thoughts, and there are quite a number of places in East Texas where we most likely could not grow alfalfa. There are some alfalfa producers in other parts of the state, in the Panhandle, as well as in the central part of the state, on different soil types compared to what we typically have in East Texas. And so why I get a lot of questions about alfalfa, it's primarily because of what is seen in popular press. So this is back in 21. This is an article on incorporating alfalfa in forage systems that was published by Drovers. And so we see a lot of information kind of nationally about alfalfa. It's a very popular legume. It is often referred to as the queen of forages, and it is because it is a legume, it's high in protein, and it is a perennial. And so probably one of the most commonly sought out forages for a lot of folks, even in East Texas, are perennial forages. Whether it's a grass, which we're primarily using Bermuda grass, Bahia grass, or other warm season perennial grasses for our forage base. But there's always interest in a perennial legume as well, for the sole purpose of not having to reestablish or plant on a regular basis. And so a lot of interest in alfalfa. There's been a lot of research out of the University of Georgia on incorporating alfalfa into Bermuda grass forage systems, whether it's utilized for grazing or for harvesting of hay. So before all of that was published out of the University of Georgia, there's actually been very similar work done at the Overton Research and Extension Center prior to my joining the team with Dr. Vince Habe and Dr. Monty Roquette. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go along to explain why you may not see as much information out of the Overton Center on alfalfa as one might like to see. Another reason folks are interested in alfalfa is because of the equine market for horse hay. So a lot of folks out of Texas probably get a lot of their alfalfa hay either out of New Mexico, Colorado, Montana, and have it shipped in or brought in. And so there's often hay producers looking for the possibility of growing and harvesting alfalfa for the horse market or for the equine market here in the state. And so that's another reason there's frequently interest in alfalfa, is primarily for that equine market. So we have to understand alfalfa, like I mentioned, it is a perennial legume, high in quality, high yielding. It is a perennial. So typically once it's established and if managed appropriately, it can maintain, or we can maintain a stand for a number of years. Now, there can be some challenges even in maintaining a perennial stand, maybe much more so than trying to maintain a perennial stand of, say, Bermuda grass or Bahia grass. And so it's not a silver bullet that some people might think that it is. Well-managed stands can last 5+ years, but there can be some challenges with trying to maintain a stand any longer than that. There is a higher initial fertility requirement, much more so than for grass. But as, of course, since it is a legume, not necessarily, we do not need nitrogen on a pure stand of a legume because we want that legume to fix the nitrogen out of the atmosphere, and alfalfa will do that. But however, alfalfa is extremely sensitive to soil pH, has high requirements on phosphorus and potassium, and can also have some recommendations or requirements on boron, another micronutrient that can be critical or important for alfalfa production and persistence. So it's not a free legume per se. And so as far as some of the guidelines that Dr. Vince Habe put together on growing alfalfa in East Texas, primarily, planning is critical, site selection, and I would say for most of us that might be interested in growing alfalfa, first step would be to evaluate our soil types, collect soil samples and analysis, and determine even if we have a suitable location to support alfalfa production. Also think about why you are interested in growing alfalfa. What are your long-term goals? Is it for hay production? Are you interested in grazing alfalfa as a forage? And then also look at the cost associated with establishment, fertilization, management, and what have you, and even harvesting. Variety selection, there are a lot of different varieties of alfalfa, so it can become very taxing to try to make a decision on a variety. There are varieties that are better suited for harvesting and those that are better suited for grazing that have a little bit more grazing tolerance. So knowing well in advance exactly how you want to use that forage will be critical to making that selection, and then understanding your location in East Texas, and making the decisions on varieties based on winter dormancy, as well as disease, insect pest tolerance, what have you. Because of course, with any plant, any vegetation, there are some challenges from pest as well as disease that could add additional cost. Site preparation and planting, and then of course weed control, pest control, insect control, and then harvesting and marketing. So if you are producing a hay crop, is there actually a market in your area? Or do you have a market to make it worthwhile economically and based on your time to produce alfalfa as a hay crop? Planning considerations, like I mentioned, intended use. Look at the cost, the economics of establishment, your maintenance cost. It may require continued liming to maintain an appropriate soil pH to support that crop, as well as additional phosphorus and potassium. And we've already mentioned harvesting and making sure that there is a market. So like I mentioned, Dr. Vince Habe has done a lot of research and has some great detailed information on soil requirement to support an alfalfa crop. It absolutely must be a well-drained soil, deep, well-drained, at least down to 3 feet. The alfalfa roots, it does produce a taproot, can get closer down into 5 and 6 feet in range or deeper if it has a site that will support that as far as soil type and even soil pH. So alfalfa does not like to have wet feet. So typically where we can grow things like Tifton 85 Bermuda grass or coastal Bermuda grass and well-drained soils, alfalfa should do well, and as far as a comparison on drainage of that soil type. Another key factor for us forage producers is herbicide application. And I've had other scientists tell me that in talking to someone who's interested in growing alfalfa, as soon as you start talking about herbicides and the impact of previous herbicide use on the success of seed germination of alfalfa, they backpedal or change their mind. A lot of us as forage producers are very attached to products like Grazon P plus D, which is picloram, or Grazon Next HL, which is aminopyrrolid. Those active ingredients, as well as others, can have residual activity, soil residue and residual activity that may not provide very long weed control, but can prevent alfalfa seed from germinating. So as you are making a site selection, you need to look back at records, at history of products, herbicides that have been used in that area, and where you intend to plant. Good soil fertility prior to planting will be critical. So soil testing is absolutely one of the first steps in making a decision on whether or not to plant alfalfa. I mentioned soil pH is very critical, and not just at a 6-inch depth. Dr. Habe recommends collecting soil samples at 6 inches and then at a foot depth all the way down into about 5 feet in depth, to not only look at soil pH, but also to potentially measure manganese and aluminum. Those are some micronutrients that, as our soil pH becomes more acidic or decreases say less than 5.5, aluminum and manganese become more readily available, and they can be detrimental to a root structure or root system, kind of impacting those root hairs and decreasing the ability of those root structures to take up water and other nutrients. And aluminum and manganese can be very toxic to alfalfa root structures. And so if your soil pH, even down to 5 feet depth, is less than 5.5, he highly recommends testing for manganese and aluminum to look at those amounts and if they may or may not be toxic to roots. So soil pH is highly critical. The best time for collecting those samples would be in the fall. So at this time of year, hopefully most of us have had some soil moisture or have some soil moisture. That makes it a little bit easier to collect those samples. And then we would be planting alfalfa in a whole nother calendar year potentially. So timing of planting is for us is going to be in that fall time period. Paying attention to phosphorus and potassium for alfalfa production prior to planting will be critical. During that seed bed preparation, if it is going to be a pure stand of alfalfa, we can incorporate those nutrients, especially that phosphorus, deeper into the soil profile to be beneficial for those plants. So soil testing will be important. So timing, I mentioned the fall is probably a better time for as we start planning and thinking about if we have interest and if we have a location that will support and determining if we have a soil type that will support alfalfa production. I failed to include another great resource to know more about the soil types on your property is the Web Soil Survey. I would highly recommend, even prior to collecting samples, is to use the Web Soil Survey to look at the different types of soil across your property. And you may not even have a soil that would support alfalfa, whether it's from drainage or primarily from drainage purposes. Dr. Habe has some great information I'm happy to share, or it can be found on the Overton website, about the research that he did and the steps that he recommends in regards to determining if your soils would support alfalfa production here in East Texas. So I mentioned liming. That will be critical 6 to 9 months before planting alfalfa. So that would be late winter or early spring, the year of fall seeding. So collecting those soil samples a year in advance might seem a little excessive, but that gives you, it's a great time to sample. And then that is when you would be planting. And we do have some seasonal shifts naturally of soil pH. And you want to make sure you have adequate time for phosphorus and potassium incorporation as well as liming in order to improve your soil pH and make the appropriate change. And depending on the quality of the limestone, that could influence how quickly you might be able to change your soil pH for that alfalfa crop. So as far as variety selection, we typically recommend selecting varieties by fall dormancy rating first, and then grazing or traffic tolerance. And then if you have interest, there are Roundup ready varieties of alfalfa that would allow you to use Roundup as a weed control, especially for grassy weed control over a stand of alfalfa. So as far as we look at that fall dormancy, if you go to, there's a National Alfalfa Organization that has all of the varieties in a catalog that can be downloaded or that you can view on your computer, potentially on your iPad. And it has all the characteristics rated for each of those varieties, whether it's grazing tolerance, if it's Roundup ready, and then fall dormancy. So depending on where you are in the state, in East Texas, anywhere you want either a semi-dormant or a non-dormant. So a variety during that fall winter period are not necessarily going to go very dormant because our winters typically aren't necessarily as severe, or our winters are much later. So dormancy earlier in that fall winter period is not as critical. So that can extend our season of use of alfalfa, which can be advantageous for multiple harvests potentially, or for grazing purposes. So alfalfa seeding rates and dates, typically the recommendation is about 20 pounds of seed per acre. always need to pay attention to seed tag on those products. This is from Hancock Seed Company, Bulldog 505 alfalfa. There are several Bulldog varieties that came out of the University of Georgia. Typically, as far as planting dates in the fall, would be mid to late September through mid-October. So if you're planting, ideally, I would recommend, if you're planting a pure stand of alfalfa, would be to plant into a well-prepared seed bed. Dr. Habe established alfalfa at the Overton Research and Extension Center, where he was harvesting it primarily for hay in his research project. So it was planted into a well-prepared seed bed. They also incorporated some alfalfa into a Bermuda grass sod to see if those two species could coexist. And a lot of research has been done at the University of Georgia, and they have had great success. However, I will tell you, at Overton, when utilized for grazing, the alfalfa stand did not last very long. It was, as it was grazed, the alfalfa was selected by the livestock, and so it ultimately became overgrazed. The alfalfa would typically be oftentimes the first thing that popped up in the spring, and the cattle would initiate grazing. And as they graze the alfalfa down, the Bermuda grass could then kind of take over and dominate the stand. So I think at most they had 3 years of that mixed stand of alfalfa and Bermuda grass, whereas Dr. Habe was able to harvest at least for 5 years and potentially longer on a pure stand of alfalfa. So in our experience in Texas, that combination of alfalfa and Bermuda grass has not been successful. The University of Georgia has found success with that. I don't know what, I'm not sure. I don't think any of us are really sure what that difference is. So it is something that you could try, but be forewarned that the persistence of that alfalfa stand could possibly be shorter when grazed. If it's harvested for hay, there is potential for it. It could potentially persist for a little bit longer if it was managed well. Now, if you are planting into a Bermuda grass sod, once again, it will be critical to be mindful of herbicides that were previously used on that pasture or hay meadow. And if it is, you are planting into a hay meadow, we're typically a little bit more aggressive with our weed control in our hay meadows. And so refer back to those records on the products, and you may need to delay planting for a year or two to make sure that you don't have any residual activity of those active ingredients in that environment prior to planting a seed. So good seed bed preparation will be critical if planting as a pure stand. Is a very small seed. I don't even think you can see the seeds in the picture, in that lower picture, but they do not need to be planted very deep. They're very small, so no deeper than, say, 1/4 of an inch. And here's a better photograph. If you look on the left, you can see those seeds are extremely small. So planting depth can be critical for success. So very small seeded. It will require fertilization. A lot of people tend to think because legumes can fix nitrogen out of the atmosphere that we don't necessarily, we don't necessarily need to fertilize those legumes. They do fix nitrogen out of the atmosphere. However, there are requirements for phosphorus and potassium. As you can see, when you look at the ratio of NP and K that are removed per ton of hay or pasture, quite a bit of potassium, much more potassium even than Bermuda grass uses. And keep in mind, for a lot of us in East Texas, potassium deficiencies are quite common, even on our Bermuda grass stands. So if you are interested in growing alfalfa, it's even much more sensitive to those potassium levels than Bermuda grass is. So phosphorus will be important, especially during that establishment season for root growth and development. Potassium is critical for yield and persistence. Boron can be a requirement. Alfalfa is sensitive to any boron deficiencies, so it will be important in soil testing to also evaluating for boron levels, and additional boron might need to be applied, especially in our sandy soils here in East Texas. As far as harvesting alfalfa for hay, it's not as easy as harvesting a grass hay or that we might be used to. So Keep in mind, majority of our nutritive value in our forages is in the leaf material. That's going to be even more critical on things like alfalfa as opposed to Bermuda grass or even Bahia grass. So timing of harvest is critical, not only to optimize yield, also to optimize nutritive value, and then to try to avoid pests such as the blister beetle. And so timing of those harvests can be important. And then making sure that we're not shattering those leaves and losing them during that harvesting process. So the first hay harvest should be at about 10% bloom, and that could be late April to early May, primarily depending on weather and success of establishment of that stand. Additional harvest could possibly be at 30 to 35 day intervals, of course, depending on rainfall for many of us. As far as grazing alfalfa, if alfalfa is to be used for grazing, these are some pure plots, pure stand plots that were established in over 10 years ago. And so grazing management will be critical because it's highly palatable. Like a lot of our legumes can be very palatable, and they can overgraze that forage very quickly. Also, keep in mind, wildlife are going to be highly attracted to our legumes and alfalfa. So keep in mind, white-tailed deer in East Texas could also be detrimental to a crop, and even young seedlings. So grazing management, protecting from wildlife, unless you are using it for wildlife, that is just something else to keep in mind. So tips in regards to establishing and maintaining alfalfa, good quality soil. If you really have interest in growing alfalfa, and some folks do, please reach out. I'm happy to share information from Dr. Habe that walks you through the use of the web soil survey. And he tells you exactly which soils in his experience will support alfalfa production, as long as your soil pH is appropriate, and then you have avoided or not used specific herbicides in a period of time. And then high fertility, paying attention to phosphorus and potassium levels along with soil pH. And then weed control during that establishment season can be important. So there might be interest in using a Roundup Ready alfalfa to help with not only grassy weed control, but even other broadleaf weeds that we tend to see especially in the spring. So some challenges with alfalfa, because it's not a perfect crop, and a challenge for us in East Texas, or in Texas in general, is cotton root rot. So it is important, if you know the history of your property, if cotton has been grown at some point, especially in most recent years, it could be challenging to have success with alfalfa in those particular locations. So that is a risk for us in Texas or in areas where cotton has been grown. It is a fungus, and there's not necessarily much we can do about it. It can be detrimental to our crop, to our alfalfa crop. There are several insect pests. The alfalfa weevil is probably the #1 insect pest of alfalfa. The weevils have snouts. You can see the weevil up there on the left-hand corner, and then the larva there on the right. And the larva will feed on the tender leaves and the leaf buds. Here are some pictures of damage from the alfalfa weevil. Feeding will reduce hay quality and yield. Obviously, they're consuming quite a bit of that leaf material. Larvae do most of the feeding damage, although the adults can also feed on those leaves. So from a distance, that field might look like it's been frosted, but once you get out and start scouting, you can see visible damage, holes in that leaf area made by those larvae, as well as the adult weevils. They are primarily a pest of the first cutting. So with any of our insect pests, scouting is critical aspect. On stands of alfalfa in Overton, they have had weevils be a problematic or a concern, especially in that early spring time period on those stands of alfalfa. Another pest that is very concerning, especially for equine or horse owners if they are purchasing hay, is blister beetles. It basically becomes a contaminant in the hay. Those dead beetles are very toxic to horses. And so, a common question from the horse market will be about blister beetles or looking for some of those crushed bodies in that hay. The beetles primarily feed on the flowers, so typically at blooming is when they're going to be problematic. So that can be kind of early or during that blooming process. So harvesting before you have full bloom not only optimizes yield and nutritive value, but can also kind of reduce the risk of those beetles. You can also control flowering weeds in and around the field, so spraying borderline areas. Any type, those other flowering weeds can attract those blister beetles to that field and can become problematic. During that harvesting, the crushing of those beetles and then wrapped in that hay is what is toxic to horses. Very, very important to monitor those. There are some insecticides I know for the weevils. I failed to remember if there are any insecticide options on the blister beetle, but would be happy to look into that if someone had a question. Other important lessons around alfalfa, whether or not to plant alfalfa, herbicides. I've mentioned that before, but I think that's very critical for those of us in primary Bermuda grass production in East Texas. We have historically leaned on those Grazon Next, Grazon P+D products for general broadleaf weed control, things like Carolina horse nettle or McCartney rose, those perennials that are very difficult to control. And we're using those products for that general broadleaf weed control in those Bermuda grass systems. And unfortunately, that there is persistence. There can be soil residual activity of aminopyrrolate and picloram in our soils for a period of time. So that is why it's important as herbicide applicators to keep records so that when we look to plant other crops, such as alfalfa, we can go back to that data, that those records to know what we applied, when we applied it, especially dates. And so we could plan on planting those broadleaf crops at an appropriate time where that residual activity will not be detrimental to those seeds as they try to germinate. Soil pH, soil fertility, very important for alfalfa production and soil testing. I feel like it's something that I often preach just on Bermuda grass production is soil testing, soil fertility. And so if you're not willing and have not been active in soil testing and maintaining soil fertility on Bermuda grass, then this may not be a crop for you. And then winter weeds will be critical on a fall planted alfalfa crop. Obviously, during that seed bed preparation, we are potentially promoting the germination of some annual seeds, grassy weeds or broadleaf weeds. And so a Roundup Ready variety is great. It gives us herbicide option for controlling some of those weeds during that establishment, especially in the spring on those winter weeds. So kind of in conclusion as to whether to plant or not to plant, I think first and foremost, you have to ask yourself why. Do you have interest in alfalfa? Is it for the purpose of marketing it as a hay crop to horse owners? That is probably where the greater value would be if you were trying to market a hay crop. Not many livestock or not many cattle producers are going to pay for alfalfa hay. Many won't even really pay for good quality or high quality Bermuda grass hay. Most folks are typically looking for an inexpensive bale of hay, especially sometimes when it comes to cow-calf production. However, horses, our equine owners tend to be very picky in regards to hay, and they're more frequently looking for alfalfa hay as a forage source for their animals. Is there a market? Do you have a market? Are you willing to go through the economics, the cost to actually get into that market? And is your location feasible? Is it feasible for you to grow alfalfa based on your soil type, your soil pH, even your soil pH down to a 5-foot depth? And are you willing to lime if needed and maintain appropriate phosphorus and potassium levels to support that crop? And know that even a pure stand may not last more than 5 years before you may need to reestablish and potentially in another location on your property. So first and foremost, determine why you have interest in alfalfa, what your overall forage system goals are beyond just growing alfalfa. And then I'm happy to send information on using the web soil survey to take an eagle eyes view of your property and look at the different soil types and the drainage capability of your different parts of your property to even determine if alfalfa would fit on your property. Go back to those herbicide records to determine if when and what products you've used in the past. And it may be something that you need to delay for even a whole nother 12 months before you really initiate that process of trying to establish alfalfa. And alfalfa is not a silver bullet as far as a forage crop. It is an excellent forage crop. It's high in protein. It's not necessary, does not necessarily produce any more energy than Bermuda grass does. And so it is a legume, so it fixes nitrogen. It saves you dollars on nitrogen. However, you will have to put those dollars into phosphorus, potassium, and more importantly, lime for many of us in East Texas. So you need to make sure that you are prepared to actually take on alfalfa management long term. And that could be additional cost and different resources in order to maintain that. So alfalfa is not necessarily for everyone. A lot of folks have found if they're trying to feed their own livestock and they have interest in alfalfa, it's often going to be cheaper for them to buy alfalfa from an environment that's what better suited possibly than it is to try to grow alfalfa for themselves. But we can grow alfalfa in Texas. It just requires some preparation and planning in advance prior to actually planting any alfalfa in Texas. And so that was kind of the quick and dirty. I did not go into necessarily a lot of details and specific details on alfalfa. Just kind of wanted to give an overview on some things to think about, to keep in mind, and what's important if you are interested in growing alfalfa and how you might go about making that decision, whether it will fit within your production system or not. So I'm happy to answer any questions. You can always reach out to me directly if you need more information, would like directions on using the web soil survey to determine if you have a site that might fit for alfalfa. And I can provide you directions on sampling at those deeper levels in order to look at or evaluate your soil pH as well as aluminum and manganese levels. So any questions?